Thanks, Pat, for that introduction. What I've got here, Pat has kindly downloaded for me some questions, which I'm going to respond to. I'm going to kind of read out some of the question, and then hopefully it'll be obvious what my answer to the question is. Just before we start, and just in general, I've been reading a lot of the postings online. I'm really intrigued. There's some excellent discussion going on out there. I'm sadly limited purely in terms of time to the extent that I can reply to anybody, and so I think this is probably the next best thing. I can, pick out some questions, the more popular questions, and tell you what I think of them. But as I say, this comes with just a general rider that I think there's some really truly interesting discussion going on. So this one is a question about the House of Lords and the Supreme Court. It's Nancy Mayer's question. I think, let me just give you a little bit of the context of the question, and then I will, as I say, cut to the chase. The question is about the House of Lords and the House of Lords Supreme Court. Obviously, the House of Lords has become the Supreme Court. The cutting edge of this question is as follows. The 8 years since 2005 are nothing compared to the hundreds of years during which the House of Lords acted as a court of last resort. And here's the question. I'm curious, has the new Supreme Court delivered better law? Can it cancel a law of Parliament? Let me take the cancelling a law of Parliament, overriding a law of Parliament, declaring it void, whatever vocabulary you want to use, I think gets us to the same point. The easy answer is no. And I suppose that begs the question, well, why then call it a Supreme Court? Because it clearly isn't supreme. Parliament is supreme. And I suppose that is the fundamental position that we are in here. The Supreme Court is not, as I guess a lot of people might understand a Supreme Court, i.e. a constitutional court that is, if you like, the guardian of a written constitution. Precisely because a Supreme Court, a constitutional court, is the guardian of a written constitution, then it would follow, wouldn't it, that that court can strike down or declare void acts of Parliament, acts of legislation, which are inconsistent with the Constitution. That would all add up. That seems to me compelling. Those points all follow from the other. That's exactly why we're calling this court a Supreme Court or a constitutional court. However, we then have to stand back from that position. The UK, this is the trouble really, the UK is exceptional here. Now, why it's exceptional is a huge question, and I suppose that this is a digression, is in part why we start with history, why this course starts with history. And I've quoted this thing, I think it's in a lecture later on. Instead of a constitution, the British, the English have history. And I suppose then what we have to say is that historically what we have is the sovereignty of Parliament. Now this of course means that courts, no court, even the highest court in the land, even the House of Lords or the Supreme Court, cannot strike down an act of Parliament, even though we're calling it a Supreme Court. Now it's supreme, I guess, to defend it in the sense that it's the highest court of the land, the highest appellate court in the land. And of course I'm leaving out here the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, because that's not directly material to my answer to this question at the moment. So, Constitution of the United Kingdom rests on the idea of the sovereignty of Parliament. Now, this, if you're not careful, I think I've said this in one of my postings, so I can elaborate on it again here. Hardly surprisingly, you might think, well, this is almost a tyrannical idea. There is no way of limiting what Parliament can do. That sounds like tyranny, doesn't it? Here is the big sovereign, the big Leviathan, if you like, whose word is law. The basic position here is that the sovereignty of Parliament is meant to reflect the will of the people. If you like, the will of the people expressing itself in a general election gives Parliament its, I'm being crude here, right to make supreme law, because the courts do not have a democratic mandate. They are not elected by the people. Therefore, it would follow, wouldn't it, that the courts cannot limit, if you like, what Parliament can do. In other words, here's the rationale, here's the justification for why the Supreme Court cannot strike down or declare illegal or declare void a law of Parliament, an act of Parliament. It's ultimately a democratic idea. Well, I guess that's one way of presenting it. When I go into detail on this in one of the lectures, I think we have to be a little bit careful to bring this idea up to date. I mean, if you read into the commentaries, the criticisms of the British Constitution, you will see, I can't quote the commentator, but one commentator says there's a black hole at the centre of the British Constitution, and that is the sovereignty of Parliament. Whilst Parliament behaves democratically, this is not a problem. As soon as it starts to behave undemocratically, you get something like what Lord Hailsham called an elected dictatorship, precisely because there is no way of stopping a Parliament with a massive majority. Obviously, this takes us to some politics, I suppose. I mean, the Human Rights Act, which goes some way to address that black hole. And clearly, the Human Rights Act is not sovereign. The Human Rights Act doesn't mean that there is a written constitution that's the convention that limits what Parliament can do. Again, I'm dealing with these points in a very basic way, but that's, I think, probably an accurate reflection of the basic position here. The Human Rights Act was passed by a Labour government, responding in a sense to the period of Conservative rule that stretched from 1979 to 1997. The Human Rights Act comes out of the Labour manifesto, which says there is a problem with the British Constitution. We need to rearrange its checks and balances. We need more human rights in there, but we're not going to bring to an end parliamentary sovereignty. So where we are at the moment, I think, is with a certain degree of tension between the idea of parliamentary sovereignty and the idea of human rights. The constitutional balance hasn't changed. Parliament is still sovereign. But if you look at what a lot of senior law lords are saying, they are truly challenging this idea that all there is in the British Constitution is the sovereignty of Parliament, and that the broader ideas of the rule of law are important as well. And, well, I'm not going to elaborate too much on that one, because I think perhaps what I'm trying to do here is just give some bones to this idea of the role of the Supreme Court and why, in effect, it's not a Supreme Court. But there's a great deal of flux, I think, in the British Constitution at the moment. I think as well there's a problem with the general doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty from a democratic perspective, given that fewer and fewer people vote, fewer and fewer people belong to political parties. Perhaps that's an argument for strengthening human rights. It's a big debate. It's a big debate that we just really, I think, are overviewing within this course. If you study law in more detail, or indeed politics in more detail, you'll see that a lot of these themes are writ large. I'm hoping that answers this question. The easy answer is a no, but that no needs to have the rationale behind it. I'm hoping that discussion gives us something of the rationale behind the answer no. The Supreme Court, House of Lords, cannot cancel a law of Parliament. But there's another part to this question, another part to Nancy Maher's question. She's curious. Has the new Supreme Court delivered better law? Now, it's a really cracking question, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to turn the question round and say, well, what is better law? I mean, better law than the House of Lords had done. The House of Lords, as Nancy Maher points out in her question, has clearly got quite a pedigree. It's been around for quite a long time. So it's almost as if I'm not quite sure how we would make the comparison, given that the Supreme Court has been in operation for, well, not that long. So there's a problem with the time frame. There's also the problem of the criteria of how we would define better law. So I would need, I think, a little more clarification, I think, to do that. I mean, obviously, one of the tendencies within discussion of the common law is always to stress the pedigree of the past and all this stuff, and clearly that's important. But, you know, any constitution, any body of law is organic. It's changing. The extent to which a Supreme Court can respond to the challenges of the present, and I think a lot of those challenges take us to human rights, I think would give us possibly, in a very vague way, perhaps a way of pushing this question forward. But I'm not sure I could do that at this point of time, given that, as I say, I'm not quite sure what the criteria of better law are, or indeed the time frame of comparison. So cracking questions. I'm hoping that gives us at least something to go on. What I'm going to do is just move on to one other question, and I think Pat's just in the background here with some other things that I'll try and, thanks very much, I'll try and respond to as well. This one is, forgive me, it's not got a name on it, but anyway, it's a definitional question, I suppose. That is, What is the difference? When would you use the words lawful and legal? So it's a question about the terms lawful and legal. Is one more correct than another? I think I'm probably using them more or less interchangeably a lot of the time. In other words, if something is unlawful, it's illegal. If it's lawful, it's legal. I'm not sure there's that much semantic distinction between these terms. I think it's often, it's a question of context, but I don't think there's anything I would say more than that in relation to that definitional issue. Let me come to another question here, which actually does move us on. Another really intriguing issue here. Is the gap between the common law and civil law shrinking? Which is linked to the question. What role does globalization play in all of this? And it's from, forgive my accent, Guillem, I think this is Tosca Diez. My Spanish is appalling, as you might have guessed from that. So the gap between common law and civil law. Well, I mean, if we go back, here's the English lawyer's response to this question is always, well, let's think about history. The common law is already, it's Norman law. It comes out of the customs of the Norman kings to a large extent. With 1066, or I guess by 1189, we can really talk about this stuff. I mean by that, the centralising tendencies of the Norman kings and the creation of the common law. I mean, that's already, in a sense, I guess an early medieval form of globalization in some ways. I mean, this all goes back as well to the Roman law roots of both common law and civil law. I mean, some people might say that ultimately the globalized form of law, at least in Western Europe, is Roman law. That's the original globalization. The original globalizers were the Romans, the Roman Empire, and its influence on certainly certain parts of the world. So to play around with this question, perhaps if we go back to the roots of the common law in the customs of the Norman kings and behind that to Roman law, we can find a common root for common law and civil law in Roman law. Obviously they develop differently, given, I guess, the geographical, historical geographical isolation from the rest of Europe of the island of, the United Kingdom, let's say. Then it comes down to some really kind of, I guess Nietzsche talks about this. The English eat too many potatoes, which is why they think in a particular way. But the point I'm trying to make here is the English Channel is very, very interesting in this regard. It's a barrier. In distinction to mainland Europe, where ideas move with people much more easily, you have, of course, got to cross a sea, albeit a small sea, a short sea. And so ideas will move differently. And so the common law begins to separate from Roman law roots. One could argue about the extent to which it's connected up with old Anglo-Saxon customs or stuff like that. So it's not as if there's ever, the two traditions never influence each other. Historically, they do. Within the context that I'm just trying to briefly outline here. So there are obviously great differences in terms of the institutions, in terms of the way they work, in terms of the courts, in terms of the lack of a central code in common law, the relative ways in which precedent works in different civilian systems. And of course, civilian systems are not all of a kind. French civil law is different from Spanish civil law, is different from German civil law, etc. Is the gap shrinking, though? Well, I think, given the recent European influence, the influence of EU law, then I think arguably it is. EU law is having a massive influence on common law. One of the things that we'll look at in the lecture, and this is a snapshot, these are complex issues, is the way in which civilian methods of interpretation, which tend to be presented as purposive rather than narrow and literal. The common law is meant to approach things in a narrow and literal way. Civil law is meant to approach things in a purposive way. That actually, if you look at the details, that doesn't really work, but let's go with it as a basic distinction for the moment. We'll see that purposive methods of interpretation are imported, if you like, via EU law, are beginning or strongly affecting the way in which common law judges interpret statutes. So that would certainly be one influence that we could point at that would suggest the contemporary common law is being influenced to a strong degree by civil law techniques of interpretation. I'm not sure I can deal with the substance of this question because I don't know enough about civil law, but certainly in terms of this course, one of the pieces of evidence in terms of this shrinkage, or this influence perhaps, might be, if I had to give an example, it would be the way in which judges interpret statutes. Globalisation. I've always had big problems with the globalisation thesis because I'm not quite sure what it means. To go back to what I was saying before, we could talk of the Roman Empire as being a globalised empire. We could talk of the gold standard as being an element of globalisation. So when does globalisation begin and end? I honestly don't know. I think one can perhaps say that in more recent terms, speed of communication, what have you, links to certain tendencies within globalisation. The term tends then to have so many things linked to it as to lose any kind of analytical edge that it might have. I think I would prefer to say, rather than thinking in terms of traditions as somehow delinked and decoupled from each other, what we always have is a massive movement of ideas with people and ones of ongoing influence between different traditions, different languages, different histories, what have you. There's if you like, an element in bastardy in all of this, at the level of language, at the level of ideas. Globalisation has always been, to my mind, that kind of ongoing hybridisation of things. Perhaps it's intensifying with technological changes. That thesis, I think, can be made out fairly clearly, but that, I think, probably just adds to the existing way in which different traditions, different ways of thinking, different ways of speaking have always influenced each other. You know, if you look at the historical evidence, this goes back to the Ice Age, 15,000 years ago. Was that globalisation? I don't know. As I say, I'm not sure I would subscribe to the term unproblematically. We've always been globalised. Still a fantastic question, really intriguing question. I'm sorry if I've not given you the answer that you might have been looking for, but as I say, I've always been a little bit of a sceptic as to the degree to which the idea of globalisation explains things other than in a really obvious way. Let me move on then to another question here. Change of theme, change of topic. I'm going to have to summarise to try and get the gist of what's being said here, but I think in so doing you might lose a bit of the richness of the analysis. But the leading link here, the question is, why is justice so expensive or dependent on the right handshake? This then links two interesting terms together: the question of justice and the question of expense, the question of money. What is the way in to this? I mean, the debate on justice is clearly as old as Western philosophy. I'm not going to try and talk about that. We're talking about a very particular idea of justice, aren't we? I mean, even if this is as much as I would say, if we're using the Aristotelian distinction, it's forensic justice, it's justice according to the law, it's what the courts do, it's not distributive justice, it doesn't really bring in, or it does via the back door, possibly, questions of distribution of resources or equality, ideas like that. That tends to be a different way in which we're using the term justice. So we're asking a question about courts, how courts operate. In modern terms, I think it's linked to the term fairness as well, which floated out in an earlier discussion. Fairness of the law is linked to the justice of the law in a commonsensical way. I don't think we have to be particularly... clearly the philosophy is intensely interesting here, but we start with common sense. And the common sense is this. You would say, would you not, a fair decision is a just decision. And that seems to me the beginning point of the analysis. Now, this is a digression. I'm trying to get to this question of cost, aren't I? Why does justice cost money? Well, here's the obvious answer. Everything costs money. We're talking about institutions, aren't we? Courts are institutions, not just staffed by lawyers or judges, staffed by the people who run the courts. So we've got the buildings, we've got the expense of the people involved. I'm being a little bit basic here, but I think the analysis starts at this point. We'd have to become more sophisticated. But my main point here, I guess, is that any question of the fairness of justice, the fairness of law, is a question about institutions and how institutions operate and the extent to which we can talk about the fairness of institutions. And that is not cost neutral. The most obvious point is we need buildings. We need a staff in those buildings. Now, I'm sure that there's a fairly wide-ranging debate on these controversial issues, but I think the opening position must surely be that the representation of an individual in court, in order for that trial to be fair, requires, not in all cases, but in 99.9% of them, that person to be represented. Now, You could disagree with this. You could say a person can represent themselves. Well, they can. They have the right to do that. One of the big problems in the British courts at the moment with the savage cuts to legal aid is the way in which people are having to do this. And what one finds is it's using up a lot of court time. Going to court is incredibly complicated, incredibly nerve-wracking. If it's your first time, and you're up against somebody who's got a lawyer or has been there a number of times, you're clearly not going to be as good as them. So what's lurking in the background here is the basic cost that representation brings with it. Now, yeah, we could have a long discussion, couldn't we, about the different ways in which legal actions are funded, whether that should be entirely private, whether it's under the purview of the state. And this will take us into politics. I know what my position is here. I'm not really going to elaborate it at this point in any great detail, other than to say that I can't help thinking that legal aid is part of the welfare state. The welfare state is actually, contrary to what a lot of people think, what makes the market operate. I'm not going to elaborate that point there. I'm aware that that's a massive generalisation, but my argument would be that legal aid or some form of public funding for law is required. As to how much is required, as to what level is required, the detail, I'm not going to go into the detail at all, because I simply don't have time. I think it would take us beyond, if nothing else, the kind of things we're thinking about on this course. But to return to my basic point, what makes law fair? What makes law fair is due process. Due process requires a number of things. One of the things that due process requires, and this is not just me saying it, it's human rights jurisprudence, or from Europe, from the United States as well, requires in certain instances representation. Representation, professional representation, costs money. So there's a bottom line, isn't there? Justice, institutional justice, fairness will bring with it, that question will bring with it, as soon as it becomes a question about the real world, a question about how a community, a political community operates, that question will bring with it a question of how we fund that, whether that's out of general taxed income, if you like, whether the state provides it, or whether it's provided by private individuals, or perhaps most sensibly by some mixture of the two. But I would like to stress that poor citizens are citizens like rich citizens and require representation in certain instances, just like we all do, and that has a cost. That seems to me what an organised form of political community is. It looks after those who don't have the resources to, for no fault of their own, to look after themselves. It's a legal aid argument then in some ways. I'm not sure if this is clearly there are many problems here that I'm not addressing about why the courts should be so expensive. It's a huge, huge debate, but at least that would clarify, I think, my starting point, at least. And I can't help thinking the commonsensical line of argument here is that if we're talking about justice in courts, we're talking about fairness. If we're talking about fairness in an institutional sense, we're talking about something that will cost money. How that money is provided, in what terms, is a huge debate. I think what I'm trying to sketch out is it's some mixture of the public and the private, but personally, for my own personal opinion, is that the state has to be involved, should always be involved. And that is then another fascinating question to spend an afternoon thinking about. People have written books on this, so this is, again, I'm afraid I'm probably just scratching the surface. I've got a short question here, and it's a question about the EU Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice, and it says, decision by the EU Court of Justice may cancel precedent. Well, yeah, I mean, the whole point of the European Union, and again, I suppose I talk about this in a little more detail in a later lecture, the price of entrance, if you like, is that you are part of a supranational structure. For this to make sense, then the lawmaking institutions in that structure have to override the lawmaking institutions of national structures, well, nation states, I suppose you could say. So it would follow, therefore, that, again, the basic position would be that, yes, it can, because that's how the EU works. You are looking at let's call it a social market, for want of a better word at the moment. That requires a law for that entire area, and for that law to be enforced in the same way throughout that area. As you might know, if you are in Europe, or you're following the news in Europe, a lot of people are massively unhappy with this, with the if you like, the ceding of sovereignty, the surrender of sovereignty to Europe. There's going to be a referendum in the United Kingdom on this issue about the role of the United Kingdom in Europe. So there is, like all these questions, there's a great deal of politics lying behind them. But at least in terms of the legal point here, then I think it would be broadly correct to say that the ECJ, European Court of Justice, if it rules on an issue, then that states the law correctly. This is, I've got something written here in red letters that says Gwilym. So I may have mispronounced that earlier on. This is a question about judicial precedent and statutes. It says this: I would like to know what occurs when a new statute contradicts previous judicial decisions. The simple answer here is obviously the statute states the law correctly. In other words, if there are judicial decisions predating that statute that are inconsistent with that statute, they would no longer be good law. This is why you should always have up-to-date legal textbooks, because the law is constantly changing. And to leave all the other issues aside, one good way of changing the law generally is to pass a general act of Parliament, which will change all the common law cases, or indeed earlier acts of Parliament, which are inconsistent with that act. So to loop that back to the idea earlier on, I mean, that is just another way, in a sense, of looking at the sovereignty of Parliament, that a new act will override existing case law. If you look at, if you've got time to look in a proper law library, you'll see that a lot of the statute books will, in their footnotes, will tell you a lot about, the cases and what has happened to them. And if you have any experience of legal archives, you can see that this issue of whether or not a case is still good law, or indeed whether or not a statute is still in force, is really the prior question that you always have to ask yourself as somebody doing practical law. This is a short course, it's six weeks, so we're not doing that on this course, but suffice to say that this point is an excellent one. We always need to be dealing with the law that is current. We can't be using law that's out of date, because it's clearly no longer good law. Right, okie doke. I've got another another question here. It's headed up tort or crime. Let me just read it out so I can try and get my own head around it. Can someone please elaborate a bit on the fundamental differences between a tort and a crime? Is the only difference intent? In other words, if you accidentally commit a crime. Okay, then there's a bit that Pat's very kindly put a big red marker for me in the margin here. Surely, if I, Adam Geary, Professor Geary, throws a piano on my head, I could well die. If he plans to throw the piano in order to kill me, it's a crime. If he doesn't succeed and I survive, I take it it's still a crime. If he accidentally drops it and I die, is it still a tort? Stephen, this is Stephen Coppinger's question, posted a day ago. It's a great question. Suffice to say that the distinction, the division between criminal law and tort law is one of the major distinctions in law. It is, we can think of the distinction resting at the level, if you like, of intent. But if you ever study criminal law, you'll see that the question of recklessness, certain crimes require, again, I'm forced to summarise incredibly brutally here, require a mental element. Now, intention, clearly if I intend to kill you and I kill you, unproblematic, I've committed homicide. If I am reckless let's say I punch you, I'm reckless as to how I punch you or where I punch you, you die, I never intended to kill you, I merely intended, let's say, I don't know, to give you a shock or to stun you, or merely to, cause you a bit of harm rather to actually kill you. But does that, my recklessness there, does that give the sufficient mental element for the crime of homicide, the crime of murder? I can't get into the criminal law doctrine, but the difficult dividing line, as Stephen Coppinger, I think, has his finger on it here, is this question of intent. Now, clearly, to look at this in a slightly different way, what we're talking about here, perhaps, if we want to try and open up the differences between crime and tort, is something that, at least in common language, we'd use the word accidental. This happened accidentally, although that hides a great deal of difficulty in itself. Let's think this through perhaps in terms of the idea of negligence. Now, negligence is clearly, well, not clearly, but let me say definitionally, negligence is a tort. And this will take us back to the piano example. So let's say indeed I am hauling this piano up on a pulley up to a first floor window, and Mr. Coppinger is walking along the street below me. Let's say that I actually know who Mr. Coppinger is and I intend to kill him. I deliberately let go of the rope and the piano crashes onto his head and kills him. Now that would put us into the remit of criminal law, wouldn't it? I mean, my intention was to kill him and I engaged in a course of action which ended up with his unfortunate demise. Likewise, we could almost use recklessness here. Let's say, oh, I see him and he's a friend of mine, I want to give him a shock, so I decide to play a joke. And what I'm going to do is I'll let go of the piano when I think he's just walked by, so it crashes down behind him, it causes a big clang, all the keys fly off, and then we both look up and we laugh. He realises who it is. But because I'm reckless, I misjudge it, and it falls on his head and it kills him. Well, arguably again, well, I was reckless, that might amount to murder. That might be sufficient attempt for homicide, or at least turn it into something like manslaughter. All of these are problematic. But let's try and then say, well, why might this be a tort? Well, let's just change the facts a little bit. I'm a responsible removal man. I'm hauling this piano up to the first floor window. Let's say the pulley. There's something wrong with the pulley. The pulley goes wrong. The piano comes crashing down, and it falls onto Mr. Coppinger's head and either injures him or kills him. Now, clearly, the idea of intention doesn't arise here. I never intended for this to happen. Recklessness, well, possibly it depends on the degree to which I should have looked after that pulley. Let's say, again, for sake of argument, that I checked the pulley in terms of the operator's handbook and all this stuff. I'd done maintenance on it, and it was unfortunate. It was, in other words, an accident. Now, this is the point I'm trying to make. To what extent could we say an event is accidental or one caused by my negligence? It's going to depend on the facts. For instance, if we go back to the facts here, let's say the manufacturer's handbook says I need to check the gearing in the pulley once every year, and I've not done that for a year, then arguably that might be negligence. If I have done that and the technical report suggests that there's no other reason for why the pulley failed, then that might just be an accident. There's clearly no liability for an accident. If I'm not negligent here, it's just purely an unfortunate accident, and Mr. Coppinger is injured or killed, then he may not have a remedy against me. Obviously, in tort law, that distinction between accident and negligent is a hard-fought one for all the obvious reasons. I'm hoping that that little overview might clarify some of those points. It's a very good question. It's a very technical question, which I think is difficult to present convincingly in summary form, because you need to already know a little bit, I guess, of substance in relation to criminal law and civil or tort law. But I think that the fundamental, I think Mr. Coppinger's got his finger on it, it's a question of intent here. So the distinction between a crime and a tort relates to intent, and the distinction between an accident and a tort would also relate to intent, with the crude argument that an accident, if it's a pure accident, whatever that might mean, then no liability would lie, because we couldn't say that anybody had been negligent in causing the loss or damage that followed from the act. Do we have any other questions?
We'll just take a break for 5 minutes.
Splendid. Okay. I'm going to have a break, and I will be here again in 5-10 minutes. Thank you for listening. Right, hello again. I've got some coffee. I've eaten hundreds of chocolate biscuits to try and get my blood sugar up so I can concentrate, and we're ready to go again. I've got some questions that have come in via email here. Some relate to tort, at least this first one relates to tort. So this is the first one I'm going to deal with. Here's the question. Quote, it's from Tracy Peel. I thought that tort meant you were always considered liable if harm was done, intentional or not. Okay, so let's just try and think about this thing here. Clearly for a tort, some kind of damage has to have been caused. Whether that damage is physical or mental is a live issue in tort. Nervous shock, for instance. The issue, though, is intentionality. This goes back to what I was saying earlier on. And let's try and just work with this idea of negligence. What does negligence mean? Again, almost in a commonsensical way. If I'm negligent and I cause some kind of harm to you, to a person, then we could say something like, well, you weren't paying attention. Now, you wouldn't say that you actually intended to cause harm, would you? You would say that harm was caused because I was not paying enough attention. I'm driving home in my car late at night, and I'm distracted, let's say. I'll pick up my phone to make a phone call. That's actually a criminal offence, but let's imagine it's not a criminal offence. I'm presumably, and I run somebody over, presumably I'm not paying attention because I'm answering my phone. Let's say, for sake of argument, this is not a criminal offence. I didn't mean to run you over. I didn't intend to run you over. I intended to answer my phone and drive the car. The trouble is, I was not paying enough attention in driving my car to not run you over. So I think we have to be careful to understand that the law of tort, and I'm being very, very general here, or the law of negligence. Negligence is a tort, a civil wrong other than breach of contract, to give it at least one working definition. Then we're not really talking about things that people intended to cause. Let me give you an example, a case called Murray and Richards, I think it's called. It's about two schoolgirls who are playing with a ruler. They're sword fighting with a ruler. I think they're around 14, 15 years old. During this play fighting with a ruler, part of the ruler shatters, and it goes into the eye of one of the two girls, and it blinds this girl. And it goes to the Court of Appeal, and the issue is to what extent is the girl who started the sword fight liable for the damage caused to the other girl. The trial court said that there was contributory negligence, i.e. they were both, they shared out the liability, if you like, 50-50, let's not get hung up on the facts. The appellate court actually said there's no liability here. This was a pure accident. Now, you can disagree with the ruling of the Court of Appeal in this case. Mullins and Richards it's called. But the point is here, if you put yourself in the mind of the girl starting the sword fight, what does she intend to do? She doesn't intend for part of the rule to shatter and to go into the eye of the other girl and blind her. That is not her intention. Her intention, if you asked her, she'd say, well, it was to play a game, to have a game with my friend, a sword fighting game. Now, you could say, well, surely you would intend, there's negligence here because some kind of injury might follow. It's the kind of injury, isn't it? You might imagine that somebody would get slapped with a ruler, which is not a blinding, is it? It's like a slap on the arm. Obviously, that's technically perhaps a tort, but, in terms of loss and damage caused, you can't really quantify it. So that would be one way of analysing those facts. The court are effectively saying, well, this is a complete accident. There is no intention here. Not only is there no intention, there's no negligence either. This girl was not negligent. This is just, to go back to what I was saying before, this was a pure accident. There is no intentionality behind it. Now, there's a very good book by Joanne Conahan, I think, called The Wrongs of Tort, which is really saying, well, are there such a thing as accidents, if you like? Now, to use the ruler example, although it's not raised as a fact in that case, to what extent could we argue that the manufacturer of the ruler is liable? Because surely a reasonable manufacturer supplying plastic rulers to a school knows that school kids will mess about, will engage in this kind of game, then surely the ruler needs to be thicker or blah, blah, blah. You get the point. In other words, there's no such thing as an accident. The fault perhaps there lies with the manufacturer. It's a huge debate, isn't it? But, I mean, in the end, what we're trying to say here is that what the law is doing in creating this idea of tort and using these ideas of negligence, which are short of intentionality, is trying to, if you like, classify or codify a kind of area of activities where, in certain circumstances, we can say that whoever causes loss or damage from them is liable for that loss or damage caused. Where those lines are, well, one would have to analyse in detail the doctrines of tort law, but if one steps back from it, then we're really talking about the social regulation of hazardous activities, aren't we? Whether you want to individualise that, which is clearly what tort law does, or there's an alternative approach, isn't there, that just says, well, we could all just have some massive insurance fund, and any time anything happens, it simply pays out. There's no need to talk about fault here. Perhaps that's the problem, i.e. it was your fault or my fault, I was negligent or was not negligent. So I think one has to kind of ask some critical questions about how these legal categories are operating. None of them are somehow natural or come imminent, or somehow are imminently founded in human activity or social activity. They're ways in which a particular discourse, law, codifies, classifies, creates a way of thinking, a set of terms that then lead to certain consequences, lead to certain institutional consequences. They're, dare we say, arbitrary. I mean, I'm sure that might upset some people, not others. The point, and there's a question coming up in a bit that I think is an interesting one here, perhaps it's a philosophical one. What grounds law? What grounds law? Does law ground itself, or is there something behind law that law is reflecting? But let's just leave that's for those who want to think about it. It's a kind of general, I guess, philosophical or jurisprudence being the philosophy of law. I mean, that question to my mind is always lurking in the background. It's a critical question about the way in which law operates, the way in which legal categories are created, and if you like, the boundaries of these categories, how these categories work. Okay, this next question Guillaume. I'm probably saying that in a slightly French way. I'm not sure if this is a French name. Tosca sounds kind of Spanish to me. Guillaume Tosca, Tosa. Again, forgive me. I'm not sure how to pronounce these names, but sounds like a Spanish name to me. Anyway, another good question. Referring indeed back to, I think, was it Mr. Diaz? Mr. Diaz? I'm not sure. Anyway, can we say that in common law an illegal act is either a tort or a crime? Well, yeah, I mean, this is that legal, unlawful thing. There is obviously what lies behind this question, I think, is that yes, one could say that if an act breaks the law, whether that law is civil law, tort law, or criminal law, then an illegal act or an unlawful act has been committed. There are obviously, though, different consequences that follow from the fact that in one instance we're talking about the breach of the criminal law, and the other instance, civil law, tort law, we're talking about a civil wrong, i.e., well, how do you explain this? The standard idea is that in civil law we're concerned essentially with two private individuals. In criminal law we're concerned with the state prosecuting a criminal. So in other words, in civil law we have two private parties. In criminal law we have the state involved, and the definition of crime is of course a question that raises general issues about political community and how we define certain things as crimes, etc., etc., etc. This is difficult, and although that's the standard explanation, I'm sure if you press it you'll find a lot of these distinctions are a little bit flaky, they don't quite work, but they'll serve their purpose for the moment. If I breach the criminal law, then I may be fined or I may ultimately be imprisoned. So that might give us one definition of criminal law, working definition, that imprisonment tends to be more of a general penalty in criminal law than it does in civil law. From memory, I think there are certain contempt of court, which is civil, defined as a civil matter, I think, can lead to imprisonment. But so there are exceptions on the civil side, but they're few and far between. In general, breach of the criminal law leads to imprisonment. Breach of civil law doesn't. It leads to a fine, a remedy, if you like, a remedy expressed in terms of damages to put right the loss or damage that has been caused. So yes, we're talking about a breach of civil law, a breach of criminal law. Thus, therefore, by definition, that act is unlawful or arguably illegal, and then it's the question of the consequences that follow from that illegality, which could generally be conceived of as either punishment through imprisonment, criminal sanction, or a fine, civil sanction. Obviously that breaks down, all these distinctions break down, because you can be fined for certain criminal offences. But I think the general argument, people are trying to find a distinction between these different grounds of civil or criminal liability, which would of course return us to our discussion of tort somewhat earlier on. A nice general question now from Julian Moraes, I think this might be. It says this: Hi, I would like to know, I'm summarising here, what I think, i.e. me, Adam, think are good, what is good about the common law and about positive systems of law. Is there something I would like to bring to the common law, something I'd like to see in the common law? What is good? It's a really interesting question. It's a good question because it's a difficult question to answer. What is good about the common law? I mean, the idea of good or bad is a kind of moral term, isn't it? So this is almost a question of, if you like, the morality of law. I suppose one of the things I've argued recently is that what law has to do is to reflect the moral status of individuals, and that this lies behind. This is not an argument peculiar to me. Others have argued this, but I think it's an interesting argument. That what lies behind the law, one of the things that lies behind the law, is that the law must respect the moral integrity of the individual. Now, I don't mean moral in a thick sense here, a moral code. What I'm meaning is that we I'd link it to the idea of dignity in human rights, if you like. I'm not going to try and summarise this argument here, but in an attempt to just respond to this question, I think that one of the good things in law, it's not always there in law, I think it's there in ideas of due process, which are there in common law, which are there in human rights law, that the law needs to begin with, and never forget, the importance of, now I'm going to say it, the human being. Now whether that's the individual, I'm not sure, but of human beings. It comes to later point that I want to respond to a question that raises this very issue. Clearly, this works itself out at the individual level. I have human rights, you have human rights, but are those those are at one level individual rights, but I'm not sure the idea of individuality, if you like, gets us all the way in accounting for the idea of human rights, or indeed in accounting for our, if you like, our individuation, which I'm linking to the idea of our moral autonomy. By that I mean I think I'm basically referring to the dignity of the human being, that there are certain things that power, if you like, cannot do to human beings because we have dignity. Where that dignity comes from, perhaps I could return to that point presently. It lies behind another couple of questions. So I'm kind of also quite interested in the way in which certain common law relationships impose duties on people with power. So fiduciary relationships, let's say, you have power over me in certain circumstances. That would make you my fiduciary. That would give you, it would give me certain rights against you, certain duties that you owe to me. In other words, what we're talking about here, I think, are the ways in which the common law understands inequalities of power and goes some way to addressing that. Once again, this is not peculiar to me. This is an argument you can find in a great American jurist, a guy called Felix Cohen, one of the so-called American realists. I think it's there possibly as well in Carl Llewellyn, another American realist, jurist, who again were very, very interested in, if you like, the politics with a small p of law and the extent to which certain kinds of social relationship could be protected, other than simply, if you like, contractual or private law relationships. So I think that's at the moment what interests me about the common law and the good things that I find within common law or human rights relate, I think, to those arguments about autonomy, dignity, and the extent to which law can protect the power or the relatively powerless from the powerful. So I'm hoping that goes some way to answering that question. I mean, we are, of course, here to return to Julian Moresse's question. We're talking about a positive system of law, aren't we? By positive here, I'm using the word in, I guess, the technical sense of positivist jurisprudence. I mean, in other words, we're concerned with law that is positive, that is made by certain identifiable institutions. Clearly here, positive law in a common law sense relates to the law made by Parliament and the law made by the courts. In other words, we can point to a source of law, and that source is a social fact. Here is a Parliament, here is a court. What they're doing, they're making law. So we're talking here about positive law. We're also talking, I suppose, about the values within law, or should be within law, so it's not strictly kind of, let's not get too bogged down in heavy jurisprudence. So it's not, perhaps, if you've got the points of reference, I suppose, well, let me say this, it's a kind of soft positivist argument. I'm not entirely happy with that. I suppose one of my reference points, again, if you have the names, if you like, or if you're familiar with this kind of work, is another American jurist, Lon L. Fuller. But I wouldn't subscribe to all of that. I think it's just a reference point. Fuller, obviously, if you have read Fuller, or if not, then he has an interesting idea about the inner morality of law. He's not a positivist, in other words. He's saying, well, look, there's more to law than simply an institution that creates law. There are certain values bound up in law, and that is important. Fuller's saying something more focused than that, but let's just take that as a very general overview of the kind of argument that Fuller is making. Then I guess in some ways I'm closer. My argument is in some ways closer to Fuller, but I'm certainly not, using Fuller here to license what I'm saying. I'm saying it's just a reference point. In other words, I think what I'm trying to say is that my concern with law is a clearly concern about what the law is, but it's also a question of critical thinking about law, which involves, I guess, these questions of value. Whether or not these are political questions is another huge theme, but I'm not sure that I would want to abandon the discussion of value, or, if you like, morality. And I'm not meaning morality here in a thick sense. I want to clarify this point, in the sense of a clear code of good and bad, i.e. a Christian morality or a Muslim morality or what have you. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean it in the sense that I was just referring to, that there is some quality of human beings that gives them, that we can use to think about what is important, what is valuable about the human being, about human beings, and the kind of communities that they live in. That seems to me a question never, ever distant from law. Some would agree with me, some would disagree with me. But I think, purely to clarify my own position, and these questions are good in that they suggest that people are thinking along similar lines, I think, allow us, I think, to engage in this very important discussion of what underlies law. What is law about? Might be one way of putting it. This next one, I think, goes directly to this point. It's from a Mr. Bob Pettix. Let me read it out because it's well phrased, and it will give you a real clear sense of what this gentleman is asking. Mr. Pettix is referring to Professor Genn. Professor Genn indicates that the central purpose of the law is to impose social order through force. That's in Lecture 1, isn't it? I would suggest that it's a French jurist, Bastiat's concept of the law, that it is a collective organisation of each individual's right to defence of his own personal liberties. Is a superior way of thinking about the law. Okay, so let's just get the key ideas, the key themes here. We're thinking about, if you like, the function, the end of law. What is law about? Professor Genn suggests it's coercive. And this is a positivist position, isn't it? I mean, we can trace this back to people like John Austin. The point of law is coercion. Coercion keeps a political community together. So it has its pedigrees, it has its philosophical pedigrees. It's in some ways linked as well to the Leviathan, to Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan. The Leviathan preserves social peace in part through coercion. The man with the biggest stick, if you like, keeps all the little men peaceful, and this is for the good of all. A crude summary of that argument. So law is fundamentally coercive. That's one line of, I guess, positivist thinking, passes through Hobbes and Austin and into that first lecture. However, what Mr. Pettix is suggesting here is a different way of thinking, and he's making reference to a French thinker, French philosopher, jurist, Bastiat, concept of law, that it is a collective organisation of each individual's rights to defence of his own personal liberties. Is this a superior way of thinking about law? It's a very intriguing idea. In other words, what's behind law is personal liberty. We start with the individual. There's an interesting kind of, is it a tension? It begs the question of relationship between the individual and the group, the individual and the collective here. I think Bastiat is moving in an interesting direction, isn't it? Because it's trying to say that, well, it's not just, in distinction to Professor Genn's point, it's not just about coercion. There's a point to that coercion, and that point is really, it's the protection of each individual's right to his or her personal liberty. It's a starting point. The word that strikes me as interesting, though, is collective organisation to the defence of the individual. These terms, they always seem to me to be in a kind of creative tension, and there's obviously a lot involved as to whether one privileges the collective or the personal, the individual or the group. I think my personal starting point would be to say that you can't do either, that you can't think of the individual without the group and vice versa, that the opening idea of law is actually something to do with collectivity. In this sense, I'm probably closer to Emile Durkheim, his kind of analysis of social solidarity, than I am to Bastiat. And if you're interested in this line, particularly a kind of French line of jurisprudence, thinking about law and society, I suppose, it passes forward into people like Marcel Mauss, and the jurist Léon Duguay, who was professor of, I think, constitutional law at Bordeaux, using this idea, I think, of solidarity. It sounds better in French. I think it's probably a French concept rather than an English one, to think in terms of the political community, what the political community is about. It's also a line of thinking that's dismissive, or at least critical, of an idea of sovereignty. It sees sovereignty as at best a derived concept. In other words, one starts with the idea of social cohesiveness and the institutions that make for social cohesiveness, and one might then move to something like sovereignty, but sovereignty is explained by social cohesiveness. Now, whether that's the defence of individual liberty, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how this concept of liberty works, other than perhaps to have a take on liberty where the collective provision of the collective resources for liberty would, I think, be, for me, the starting point. In other words, I think liberty is an inherently communal idea. For instance, let's reflect on our present condition. of language, of a fairly educated form of discourse, what have you. I mean, that is me exercising a liberty, my liberty to talk to you, your liberty to listen. Is that individual, or does it presuppose an entirely, collective structure, a technological structure, a social structure, and moreover, quite a lot of hidden labour. The hidden labour, certainly, of my parents who brought me up, who got me to school, the public provision of my education, which is, provided generally. In other words, where do I begin and all that ends? Where are again, an interesting question. Where are the boundaries here? Because we are individualised, because of our consciousness or what have you, our embodiedness, we tend to think through things through in individual terms. It's a starting point. It's very important. I'm not saying we jettison it, but perhaps if we start with that, we may mislead ourselves as to the relationship between that idea of individuality and that the relationship of individuality to collectivity, or to the group, or to the commune, if you like, if you want to use another particularly loaded term. I'm not sure where these boundaries are. So Bastiat, I mean, perhaps more interesting in some ways than Austin for me, but if we're going down that kind of line of French thinking, then I think my major point of reference may be Durkheim rather than Bastiat. Although Durkheim says very interesting things about crime, but I don't think we can really refer to that unless anybody wants me to, either now or later, about the nature of crime, about the nature of criminal activity, and in turn the way in which that relates to collectivity, to communal being, let's say. Let me move on. I mean, these are all really interesting questions. I think we can only scratch the surface. Tanya Ketteringham says, when and how was forensic science incorporated into the common law? I have to say I don't actually know the answer to this question. I guess it depends what you mean by forensic science, and that would take us to the law of evidence. Clearly the law of evidence changes as technology changes, as more and more refined and scientifically sophisticated techniques become available. I think if you look at the law of evidence, you will see that those technological changes are matched by legal changes as well. But unfortunately, I can't give you anything other than a very, very general answer to that question. And I'm also, I suppose, trying to dodge the issue by saying, well, what do you mean by forensic science? I mean, because looking at a fingerprint through a magnifying glass could be forensic science, or even earlier forms of detection like that are techniques, scientific techniques perhaps, and they always relate to the law of evidence. So sadly a question I'm afraid I've not done justice to particularly, but I'm sure if you're desperately interested in this, if you just pick up an up-to-date textbook on evidence, the law of evidence, you will see the way in which various scientific techniques have influenced the way in which the law of evidence develops. This brings me to my next question from Diana Carolina. The question is this: how does the precedent of English courts affect the courts of other countries of the Commonwealth before and after independence? This is a stunningly interesting question that takes us to, I suppose, recent history. And I'm afraid I don't have a good answer. I remember, this is a by the by, I had a sabbatical once in Uganda, and I was in a library in I think the Ugandan Ministry of Justice. And what they had there was hundreds and hundreds of very, very old textbooks which reflected not the Commonwealth but the Empire. All this case law and statute and what have you that related to the way Uganda was governed prior to independence was all just, it's now, other than of historical interest, it's clearly not current law. And so there is a huge jurisprudence, a huge history that's bound up with this question here. Let me just take a single element of it. I mean, it takes us to the role of the Privy Council, which is a British court, which is still, I think, the final court of appeal for certain Commonwealth countries. So this is about the influence of British common law on the development of other countries' common law jurisdictions. Now, I'm trying desperately to remember a point, I think, from Trinidad about issues in relation to the relationship between the court of the Privy Council and the final court of appeal in Trinidad. I think that the rulings of the Privy Council and Commonwealth case law is persuasive, create persuasive precedents for British courts. In other words, they're not binding, they're persuasive. that reflects, well, what does it reflect? Let's name it a colonial inheritance, a relationship of hierarchy between the periphery and the centre. And I think the present kind of tensions between the Privy Council and other final appellate courts in Commonwealth jurisdictions reflects a working out of the post-colonial legacy, could we say this, as to the relationship between an independent country and the former colonial power. My guess is that this will take some time to work itself out. Again, I don't have this stuff at my fingertips, but the issue that has raised some concerns, I think, is the death penalty. And it's interesting that that is one of the scenes, if you like, where this post-colonial drama is playing itself out. So the answer in bullet points, at least the partial answer to your question in bullet points, is that Commonwealth cases are persuasive in British law. I don't know the answer as to the other way round, and I suppose the other point, i.e. the relationship of British cases to authorities in Commonwealth jurisdictions. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. Perhaps if there's any Trinidadian lawyers or any other Canadian lawyers, what have you, they might be able to advise us on that one. Let me generalise. I think it's got a lot to do. These legal relationships have to be viewed, if you like, within that historical backdrop, within that backdrop of the working out of post-colonial relationships within law. Okay, an evasive answer again, a partially evasive answer, I'm afraid, in relation to that question from Diana Carolina. And last question I have here is from Cheyenne Kolaja. The question is as follows. What is the role of Queen Elizabeth II in the common law at the present era? Apart from the UK, she is responsible for the entire EU, is it true? Kindly clarify. Well, let me begin with that first bit. I think we could almost say that the influence of the Crown on the common law is more or less nil, zero, which is not to say that the present monarch, Elizabeth II, does not have a constitutional influence. I mean, to summarise the history here, I mean, the Crown is primarily said to be symbolic. I mean, one way in which we glimpse this is the way in which a bill only becomes an act once it's signed off by the monarch, which I think there's only one example of that not taking place in 1789, I think, the Scottish Militia Bill. The ruling monarch refused to sign that off. But so, we've got one thing to go on in all that time. So it rarely happens. The Crown has that symbolic role. I guess the whole cast of English history, British history from about 1649, I mean the end of the Civil War, to the present day is really the way in which the Crown is retained and retains a kind of symbolic importance rather than, I feel like, a practical importance in the day-to-day running of the country. Having said that, Elizabeth II has outlasted a fair number of prime ministers, and some commentators have suggested that one of the important points of continuity within the Constitution is, in fact, and this is almost like the personal role of the monarch, are the relationships between Elizabeth II and the various prime ministers she's seen come and go over, that period of time. So I think the easy answer is to say that the Crown retains a symbolic role in terms of the Constitution. In terms of the development of the common law, then negligible. Clearly, the idea is that the Queen appoints judges, but I don't think that has any truly material effect on the development of common law doctrines, let's say. It's important, I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it's not a direct influence on the law. She's not responsible for the entire EU. I think I can categorically state that. Her functions relate entirely to the United Kingdom, although I'd have to say I wouldn't claim to be any kind of expert on the constitutional role of the monarch, but I think probably that's more or less accurate in terms of the general position. I think that brings us to more or less the end of this session. I'm just looking at Pat here.
Yeah, one last question, which was about, that came from the chat about equity, and whether equity is still used.
Okay, does that relate to that one, or is it a different?
No, it's a different one.
Different one. Okay. There's two things, in fact. I had another question here that Pat kindly gave me, and there's, as you may have heard in the background, there's an issue in about equity. So let me start with the easy question. Is equity still used? Well, yes, it is. Equity is very important. Equity is a source of law. This is talked about, I think, towards the end of lecture 2, I think I'm right in saying. Just to clarify the basic points, the equitable courts were not strictly common law courts. They were the Court of Chancery. I think I summarised the history. I'm not going to go over the history again. But since the Judicature Acts of the 1870s, these courts are fused. So the common law courts, the courts of equity, are fused. In other words, if you go into, let's say, the court of the High Court, or that's a bad example, the Court of Chancery or another civil court, you can obtain both an equitable remedy such as an injunction and a common law remedy such as damages from the same court. Previously to that, you would have to have gone to the Court of Chancery to obtain an equitable remedy. I suppose the other thing worth saying is that some kinds of legal relationships come out of equity, in other words the Court of Chancery, rather than the common law. So if one thinks of the trust, crudely somebody looking after something on behalf of somebody else, that is a concept developed by the Court of Chancery. It's an equitable concept. It's not a common law concept. So equity is still phenomenally current. I think I'm right in saying, although again, if there are American lawyers out there, you could perhaps correct me on this point, or advisors on this point. I think equity tends to mean something slightly different in the United States. But certainly in terms of how I understand equity, is it's a source of law. It's not strictly a common law source of law, although if we are using common law in the sense of a legal family, then I suppose we are implicitly confusing, isn't it, referring to equity. The point that I discussed in the lecture, the case Lloyds Bank and Rossett, was about, I think, a form of equitable vehicle, a constructive trust, not an express trust, but a kind of legal relationship that again is equitable rather than common law. So given that trusts and constructive trusts are still current and still useful, still used, equity is still of immense importance. If you study property law, in the United Kingdom, a lot of the time you will be looking exactly at these relationships. So yes, equity is fundamental. Now there's a really interesting question which I want to end with here from, again, I have to apologise for my pronunciation, Andre Luis Arnott Ramos, I think that is. Very detailed question about the relationship between jurisprudence, legal thinking, legal philosophy, and common law thinking around the issue, around the concept of possession. The question makes reference to various intriguing concepts and legal thinkers like von Savigny and the German jurist von Ehring, I think it is. I can't really deal with the detail here. In fact, I'm going to have to look it up and think about this. But the question, I'm going to interpret this question as a question about possession and how we can think about possession within the context of our discussion at the moment. And I really just want to use this. I'm not doing justice to this question, I'm afraid. I apologise for that. But how we can just return to that point about equity. Common law. Historically, you either owned something to a thing, or you didn't. You either had title, or you did not have title. The trust is a blurring of those boundaries. If I am looking after something on behalf of somebody else, what rights does that somebody else have against me? Because as you can guess from the way in which that thing is set up, that person has something less than ownership. In a sense, I have ownership because I am looking after it. But however, looked at from my point of view, I don't own it because I'm looking after it on behalf of somebody else. Now, this is often given as an example of the genius of the common law. For civilian lawyers, this might be the confused nature of the common law. My understanding is that Roman law always made a distinction between rights in rem, rights over a thing, and rights in personam, in other words, rights relating to a person. What equity did, what the Court of Chancery did in relation to this idea of the trust, or somebody looking after something on behalf of somebody else, is in fact to give that somebody else, let's call them the beneficiary, a bundle of rights, both rights in rem and rights in personam. In other words, if I'm a beneficiary under a trust, if somebody is looking after something on my behalf, I have rights over that thing, the thing in trust, and rights over the person who is looking after that thing. So equity lawyers in common law, and there I'm referring to the familial nature of a legal family, are bringing together two Roman law concepts, i.e. rights which relate to a person, rights which relate to a thing, and, if you like, hybridising them. To go back to an earlier point I made, there's a great deal of hybridity, I think, in the common law. It's mixing these concepts to produce something new, the idea of a trust, which I don't think you find in that form, do you, in civil law? I remain to be corrected on that point, no doubt. So it depends really what you mean by possession. The question raises some very, very interesting things about when you talk about possession. You're talking about a relationship between a person and a thing, or a social relationship. Possession, to understand possession, perhaps we're talking about a social, symbolic relationship defined by the law. It makes me think of Hegel, quite honestly. That's my point of reference here in relation to this question, but I don't really want to talk about Hegel at this point in time. And partly that's an excuse, because I don't know enough about civilian property theory. But I can't help thinking that all these relationships, property relationships, are fundamentally social relationships that the law thinks about and codifies in a particular way, and that particular way in which we can think of a fairly precise mode of relationship over a thing, i.e. the trust. The way the equity conceptualises that is to mix together two Roman law concepts that I think strictly would be kept apart, i.e. rights over things, rights over people. We consider them as separate branches of the law. Common law doesn't do that; it brings them together. That's just a different way in which a particular branch of doctrine, particular way of thinking, is codifying a social relationship, which is both a relationship between people and things. I think I might have to leave it there. Fantastic questions. I'm really enjoying thinking about this stuff and watching what's going on in the various postings. So thank you very much for listening. No doubt we'll have a chance to correspond again. And I will say thank you, and I was going to say good night, but given that there's people all over the world here, I'll simply say see you soon. All the best.